have entered a season of Lent, as some of you may remember, though we didn't have a service for Ash Wednesday. We are in this journey of Lenten season. And Lent is usually a season for self-examination. It is a time where different people take different measures to pause and do a self-introspection to look into their hearts and their lives to see what is not aligned with God's plans and purposes. And we are here doing the series on the Sermon on the Mount, and we are at a text which is a great text that is asking us to do exactly that. You know, we started last week where we have come to the point in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is beginning to apply all the things that he has been talking to us so far, calling us into action. He's asking us to examine our lives in the light of what he has shared and taught so far to see how we are in all these areas that he has expounded for us. So I would encourage us as we are in the season of Lent, in addition to whatever passages you are reading for your personal time of study, to go through these 3 chapters more intensely with an open heart to introspectively look into your own lives and see what God would have us to do. And so I gave a brief synopsis last week of how Jesus is applying this sermon for us. You know, he's applying this sermon by saying, he gives us 3 parallel illustrations. First, he gives a command and says you have to enter. There are 2 ways, and you have to enter between those 2 ways. And then he talks about the passage we read today where he talks about 2 types of trees, you know, which produce 2 types of fruits. And finally, he's going to conclude by giving us the example of 2 types of homes and the foundations on which they are built. You know, if you read this application passage, you get a very different tone from what Jesus is talking about. There is an underlying tone of judgment that he is bringing into the fore. You know, this past week was a very heavy week for me. I was visiting someone in the intensive care unit of El Camino Hospital. And thank you. As I walked in, I did not know them before. And this was a young Indian professional in his mid-30s. He was fighting for his life and in the ICU. And he was declared brain dead. And just as I walked in, I met his wife. She's working too for a software firm, and she was in tears because the doctor was talking something to her before I entered. And as soon as I went in, she said, the doctor's given up hope and they're going to pull the plug. And when I asked her what happened, you know, does he have any medical complications? She said, he was perfectly fine till 10 days ago. He went grocery shopping. And as he was walking around in the grocery shop, he just collapsed and hit his head on the ground. And subsequently, they found that all his brain arteries had ruptured and his blood pressure was very high. And they did not even know that he had this condition. And she said in the flick second, life changed. And they have an 18-month-old son who was, with some of his friends. And within a few minutes of our conversation, they pulled the plug and he passed away. And imagine that. You know, I know there's a lot of fear and, you know, people are scared and panicking about coronavirus. That's not the only thing that can kill us. You know, we have a God who is more sovereign and our lives are in his hands. So the question to think about seriously is, am I ready to die? And the reason why we are so panicky and so afraid and so fearful is most of the time, most people do not think long enough to see what happens to me if I die tonight. So Jesus is bringing this entire sermon into focus and asking us an eternity question. Do you know what is going to happen from an eternal perspective? And he starts by saying there are only two ways. There are only two ways. Most of us, we may think, I have my own way, I like to live my life my own way, and I believe it will not make a real difference when I die. He says that's not true. Some people tell us, well, everyone does their own thing, always lead to the same end. And Jesus says that's not true either. He says there is a narrow way and there is a broad way, And he talks about the characteristics of how to enter them. There is also a narrow gate to enter this narrow way. And the broad way as a broad gate, and life goes on there. And you'll be surprised how he says at the end, contrary to what you may think, entering to the narrow way is actually easier than walking the broad way. You don't have to clean yourself up before you enter. Or you can't work hard enough or pay your way to enter into this way of life that I am calling you into. It's through me that you come in. So if you missed this, I would encourage you to listen to the sermon from last week to understand that. But it's all about Jesus encouraging us to act. And says, if you choose the narrow way, your end is going to be life, and you will not be afraid to die. But if you choose the broad way and think all ways are same and I'm going to live my way, your end is destruction. And you need to be worried about that seriously. So after he unpacks and challenges us and asks us, hey, where are you heading in life? Today he is shifting the focus to talk about authenticity. He says, how do you know if you are in the way that leads to life? And the simple answer is authenticity. When we are living in this world, we are only exposed to this broad way. We all succumb to some level of peer pressure. Most of us spend most of our time comparing our lives to the lives of those around us and seeing if I'm doing better than them. Do I have a better job? Do I have a better house? Do I drive a better car? Or are my kids doing better than other kids? Or am my friends getting better grades than me? And these are the metrics we use to see, am I okay? Or if I am not okay? Especially for us Asians, education trumps spirituality. That's the God we worship. And we even come up for all sorts of justification to give that the highest pedestal in life. Just, we don't have to be fooled, because that way may look like it's the way of safety and security for the world, which everybody runs. They're thinking that if we follow this path, we'll be safe, our children will be safe, and their future will be safe. What if our children get the best education and lose their faith? And it happens all the time. What if you get your dream job at the cost of your own spiritual growth and live a mediocre, nominal Christian life and starts affecting your marriage and your family? So Jesus says it's time to wake up from your slumber, and especially in the season of Lent, examine your hearts. Am I walking in this narrow way, or am I still in this broad way? So it starts with our hearts, and he starts his directive at the leaders. He says, authenticity, if that is the measure to know if I am walking in the narrow way, it needs to begin from the top. So he gives 3 characteristics of authentic leaders and false leaders. Just as we have so many influences vying our attention in the world, we are being influenced constantly by different leaders and different voices who are trying to promote to us their understanding of who God is and what life is. But he says, beware, because there are false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. There are three characteristics he talks about that distinguish authentic leaders versus false leaders. The first is their attitude towards God's children. The attitude towards people in the church. These false prophets, they come in sheep's clothing. The sheep is a synonym for the children of God. They look like you and me. But inwardly, there are ravenous wolves, which means they are here only for themselves. They actually do not care about anybody. They are so self-centered, and all they care about is their own glory, and they are not concerned about the glory of God or the welfare of his children. So that's their first characteristics. Their attitude towards Christians is self-centeredness. Secondly, he says, this is how you will recognize them. You will recognize them in verse 16 by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. It's in spring, close to the Bay Area where we live, we have several opportunities that will start coming up for fruit picking. So a few years ago, few of us as friends, we went to do cherry picking. That was the first time I ever saw a cherry tree, and in one of these cherry orchards. And I don't know if you have done this, but if you walk in, they let you pick as many cherries as you want. You can eat as many as you want while you are there, and you can even buy some in excess of whatever you pluck and weigh them and take home. And since it's your first time and you don't know how to distinguish, so you go around, and I was picking these cherries along with our friends, and very quickly we found that not all cherries tasted the same. Though they all looked the same from outside, some of them had this special sweetness to it. And we even had a friend who got a whole bucket of them, and then he panicked saying, I'm not going to eat all this, and we had to end up eat the rest. I won't tell you who that friend is. But then there were these other cherries, you couldn't even put them in your mouth. It was so sour, and it was not even ripe enough that we could not even taste it, as soon as you put it in your mouth, you felt like spitting it. So he says, in the same way, everybody looks the same from outside, but you know them by their fruit. So he says, a good tree cannot produce bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. So how do you check if someone is authentic or faking it? And we live in a day and time where there are so many people who fake these things. In fact, the word he uses for a bad tree, the word is actually referring to poison. It's not just bad, it's poisonous. When you taste that, it actually destroys you. And that is the effect that these leaders can have on you. And so he says the first thing you do to check who you are being influenced by, the voices that you are hearing, the things that you're reading is, you need to look at the fruit of their life and teaching. These are people who first start by not teaching about the narrow way. These are people who try to say that everything is fine, and they actually encourage people to go in the broad way. The right teaching leads to right living. So if you are hearing the right truth, then it should have some impact in your life, that you also start producing fruit. So that's the question he says. You want to know whether you're trusting a leader? Look at their life and their teaching. Is that fruitful? Do you see evidences of the fruit of Spirit in their lives and in the ministry they have done and in the lives that have been touched? It begins with me. It begins with any of us who are involved in any kind of leadership in the church. And that's why the scripture exhorts us to watch our life and doctrine closely. The Christianity has been plagued with all these false teachers who have really undermined the essence of what authentic Christian life is. I remember when I was a new and a young Christian, there was this big famous Korean preacher who came to town. His name was Paul Yonggi Cho. He filled up an entire auditorium, and that was the first time I was listening to him. I was just amazed. He would tell stories like Jesus would come and sit in his car and talk to him and tell him to go do all these crazy things. And he said Jesus told him to change his name. So he changed his name from Paul Yonggi Cho to John Yonggi Cho. And I was like, wow, I want to see that Jesus. I don't like my name too. I want to change. I don't know what name to change. But Jesus never showed up for me. So I still have the same 5 names in my passport, and it gives everybody a headache. Well, fast forward in 2012 or 14, when I was in Singapore, the same preacher came to Singapore. And as soon as he landed, there was another preacher like him there. The Singapore government clamped down on both of them for serious fraud. And in 2014, Paul Yonggi Cho was taken down by the Korean government for embezzling $12 million. You see, but he didn't start right there. His first teaching was on the 4th dimension. He was teaching about faith and how by faith you can claim everything. It's just name it and claim it and get it. So he was preaching of a theology of faith in faith than faith in God. And a life that is lived like that, when taken to its logical consequences, makes you a person like that. And that's what happened to him. But there are still people who blindly follow them. They would not even consider that he is a false prophet. Now, let me ask you the question. Can you name a few false prophets or teachers who are living right now? We have been told to not think that critically, because even if you think, it makes you feel like you're bad. But there are Paul Yonggi Chos all around the world. We're not trying to put down anybody, but we want to be also cautious to see, because it's a question of authenticity. I grew up listening to sermons by Dr. D.G.S. Dinagaran. He's a famous evangelist in South India. He had this huge organization called Jesus Calls, and they did massive work. And then comes his son, Dr. Paul Dinagaran. I got to meet him too and got to know them a little bit. But here is their model. They have prayer towers across cities, but if you have a little more money, you'll be assigned a personal prayer partner who'll pray for you. And if you're a business partner, if you give them a portion of your profits, you go to a higher class of receiving prayer support. Isn't this weird and absurd? Now, if he would not qualify to be a false prophet, who else would? In the scriptures, prophecy is not foretelling. Oh, this is what's going to happen in the future. That's called divination. It's forthtelling, telling God's word as it applies directly to our hearts. And yet, we have hundreds and thousands of Christians who blindly follow them because they like what they teach. But those can be these outliers, big names, but you and I need to be careful. We are in danger of becoming like that too. If we don't watch what we believe, and if we don't watch how we live. And that's the first challenge. He says, you want to know if you are an authentic disciple, if you are walking this narrow path, then the authenticity of your life and your teaching will show it. So if we are leaders serving one another, the first thing to ask ourselves is, why do I do what I do? Do I do it out of a genuine love and care for people God has entrusted to me, or I do it for myself? Am I doing this to get a name for myself, or am I doing this really to show love and care to others? If we can answer that question honestly, it's pretty easy to know if we are authentic or not. Secondly, he now moves on to everybody else. He talks about what are the characteristics of authentic versus false disciples. In verse 21, he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" Now, this is an even more alarming challenge, where he is asking all of us, you think you're a Christian? If you think you're an authentic Christian, check this out. He's looking at a group of people. He says they first do several things. First of all, they believe the right things. They are very orthodox in their doctrine. Because it says in the Greek, they call him Lord. The Hebrew equivalent for Lord is Yahweh in the Old Testament. It means it's the name that God revealed to Moses when he met him in Exodus chapter 3. So they knew the right things about God. They knew that he is God. They believed that he is the Son of God. They would perfectly recite a systematic theology for you. Now, not just were they in their mind having the right understanding, it says they were also emotionally involved. They just don't call him Lord. It says they call him Lord, Lord. In the Bible, whenever a person is called twice, it's called intensity of emotion. Like Martha, Martha. Or David, when he loses his son Absalom, he says, "Absalom, Absalom." So when someone says, "Lord, Lord," it means they really have a lot of emotion and feelings for God. They're not people who just have a cerebral knowledge of God. They're also emotionally involved in their relationship with God. They're truly excited about Jesus. They will even cry in worship services. They are that involved. Now he says, not just that. You can believe the right things about God. You can be so emotionally involved in your experience of God. He says these people also share in authentic service, acts of service. He says, "See, on the last day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name?" In your name, what's that? "Did we not do many miracles in your name?" And Jesus denies them, saying, "Liars." He says, "I never knew you." Now that is dangerous. How can someone who is orthodox in their understanding of doctrine, who are emotionally involved in their relationship with Jesus, who are actively involved in doing acts of service, how can Jesus look at them and say, "I never knew you"? He's not saying, "Oh, you are just some backsliding Christians, you just need to come back." He says, "No, you never knew you." Of course, it's important to know if you don't have all these three things, you're not a real authentic Christian. But the corollary is just because you have these three things, it doesn't mean you are an authentic disciple. You can still be faking it. Now that is scary, isn't it? So what then makes one authentic? What is a true measure of an authentic Christian? And he thankfully unpacks that for us. He says the mark of an authentic Christian is not someone who is more moral, someone who is more controlled, someone who has just greater character than others. It says the mark of an authentic Christian is someone who has learned to surrender their will to the will of the Father. It's about lordship. It's either Christ is Lord of all or not at all. You can't cherry pick some areas in your life and say, "In these, Jesus is my Lord," and these he is not. So how would I know that it is not my will, but it is the will of God the Father? Well, it is very straightforward. When I say I surrender my will, God, it is not yours, then I go back to the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, God's will is that you forgive your enemies, you love your enemies. Am I able to do that? God's will is that I be a truly meek person, that I be poor in spirit, that I be pure in heart, that I will live a sacrificial, selfless life. And God's will is that I will not be anxious about anything, that I let God and my faith in Him supersede all other fears in my life. And God's will is that when someone comes and points things in my life that are not aligned with the will of God, I'm not defensive, I'm not arguing, I'm not angry, but I'm open and I'm willing to let God mold me and change me. And God's will is that I don't live my life to make more money, to be more successful, to be more powerful, but I live my life to serve those whom God has placed around me using His gifts, His talents, His abilities. And God's will is that I go to Him through Christ and Him alone and not my merits. Jesus demonstrated all of this. It says He was obedient even to the point of death on the cross. That He prayed, yet not my will, but your will, Lord. And He surrendered His will. And therefore, through Him alone, you and I are accepted by Christ, which is so freeing. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, do I have a personal relationship with Jesus? You see, that is the point of all that Jesus said. When He says, I never knew you, what is He actually talking about? He says, I don't have a relationship with you. Yes, you may know all the right doctrines. Yes, you're excited when you do a worship song. Yes, you are so busy in serving me, but you hardly spend time with me. You're not passionate about having the time with me alone where we can just commune together. You're not willing to wait long enough to hear me speak into your heart and speak into your life. In fact, you hardly even have a moment to spend with me. Then don't tell me, I am all these. You're not an authentic follower of mine. Because Jesus is not trying to create a breed of religious people who can just walk the walk. He is wanting to create a breed of disciples who are intimately, passionately connected with Him, who can walk the walk, talk the talk, and walk the walk. And that's the challenge for us in this season of Lent, to ask ourselves, am I an authentic disciple of Jesus Christ? Will I be one of them to whom Jesus looks and says, I never knew you? Or will I be one when Jesus looks at me and says, this is a man after my own heart? May that be our prayer as we go through the season of Lent. Let's pray.